So, yeah, I guess I am on. Thank you, everybody, for this morning and for now. It's really been a beautiful visit, not just the weather that you dialed up for us, which has been amazing, especially pointing out that it's really hot and raining where we're at. And last night, 2 blocks from where we live, there was a major altercation such that the mayor of our city had to put a curfew last night. So we picked the right time to not be there and to be here. It reminds me of one of my favorite country western songs, God is great, beer is good, and people are crazy. So in any event, the really good news, if I may, is that this is a community that really is aware and pays attention. I really loved the questions earlier this morning. The bad news is, step by step, you walked through everything I had prepared for my devar. And so I've had to really refocus just a little bit. Some of it will be maybe redundant to some of the answers I gave, but I hope it'll be a little more systemic and systematic. But I also want to go into some more depth. But part of that will also invite any conversation or question, because the questions were not organized in such a way as to walk through the thought processes. And so this may provoke some different thoughts, different lines of thinking. And as I did express earlier, the best type of engagement is where there's engagement. And so I guess rule number 1 is if I'm standing in front of a community, a congregation, and it's sermon time, I would much rather have a conversation than just tell you everything that's on my head. And so there are times that are appropriate for both, but my preference will always be to have a conversation. Okay? That said, I felt like starting today by saying, hi, I'm Mark Klein. I'm a recovering attorney, as if I'm in a group, because I see the world, and specifically the Jewish world, through a very different lens than a lot of my colleagues. I've never seen our tradition as being a mandate, and certainly not as an exclusive mandate for a group of people. And from the beginning of my re-exposure, my adult exposure to our Jewish tradition, I've always understood it in a very broader context. And so I go back, if you will, with me a couple billion years. You know, I think it's safe to say none of us were there at the time. I get accused. I've been asked if Paul McCartney had a band before Wings, but we go back a couple billion years to creation, however that looks. And according to the book of Proverbs and the rabbinic tradition, Torah precedes creation. And it happens in a host of ways. One, the Torah begins with a bet and not an aleph. And why not an aleph? To show that this wasn't the first thing created, that there's stuff before us. The bet opens into the flow of reading, but is closed from behind, so we're not really supposed to have access to the what was. It's part of that mystical tradition. It's there. And what it is that is there could be just the things that are miraculously appear in the Torah, the talking serpent, the donkey that talks, the Torah itself, the wells of water that Miriam miraculously make appear, etc., etc. It could be other worlds were created. Other worlds created and are out there, or created and destroyed. But it also reminds us that we're not the ultimate thing of creation either. We are part of God's creative process, whatever that ultimately means. And so if Torah pre-exists, then it's the blueprint for how we're supposed to see the world and operate in the world. And in that role as the blueprint, we have to acknowledge a couple of things. One, because the Torah says X here and Y there, there's no place in our tradition for an answer. There's lots of answers, and as we pointed out earlier, if you have 5 Jews, you have at least 7 opinions, and if one of those Jews is a rabbi, it's oh my gosh, okay? So the goal for us is to engage, and in that engagement, we learn from each other, and as we grow in that learning and in that sense of dignity, we do the work of saving the world. Not for us, but for the bigger us. And lots of pieces of our tradition point to that idea. Perhaps the best well-known, Isaac Luria, who is one of the greatest mystics of our tradition in the Zohar, he's depicted in his commentaries as God creates this world of this vessel of pure light. And by the way, this is the really abridged version of Isaac Luria's creation story. But God creates this vessel of pure light and tries to stuff it into the existent universe. And that vessel shatters. And God wants to rebuild that vessel, but God can't reach all of the small pieces. And so God animates those shards of light, dictating that they come back together. And that's where we get the phrase, letaken et ha'olam, to repair the world, is to repair this broken vessel. And so our job as humanity, not just as Jews, is to find our place next to the shards of light that we're like rebuilding a puzzle that fits so that we can rebuild this pure vessel. And that's the mystical understanding of the Messianic age. When we get to that place where we've restored light to this world, we're at peace. And peace is not how we normally would use the term in common parlance. We're not at peace because we haven't screamed at each other today. Peace isn't about that the guns aren't blazing. The word shalom comes from the Hebrew word leshalem, the verb to make whole. If you go into a grocery store and you put something on the conveyor belt and it gets bagged as you've paid for it, and that's leshalem, to complete the transaction. And so the word shalom means that we are more whole. We've completed the transactions of humanity because we've done the work of greeting each other. So when we say hello, goodbye, or peace, shalom, we're not really saying that. What we're saying is my world is more whole because we've engaged. And when we part and we say shalom, we're saying I'm not going to let go of the new peace that I have, and I don't want to take back the peace that you've taken from me. And when we can walk through the world with that sense of engagement, that's how we restore this vessel. So it's about all of us. The Torah is given in Sinai in the wilderness, and as the Mechilton, the late Rabbi, said, it's given in a place that's owned by nobody, including Israel, so that nobody, including Israel, can say it's all mine and only mine. Because if it was the blueprint for creating the world, then it has to speak to everybody in the world in the variety of traditions. And just if you look at the Western world traditions, the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran, all come from these same stories. And by the way, if you look into the Eastern stories, the Bhagavad Gitas and the Hindu tradition, a lot of the things that are in our Torah come from the much earlier dated Eastern traditions as well. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the most ancient of biblical creation stories, talks about an ark that saved humanity and animals from the flood. And that predates a Noah story, a couple thousand years. There's a story born to people about a people in captivity. The edict is death to male children. A boy is born and he is saved from being killed by putting him in a basket and putting him down the river. He is pulled from the river by the princess and raised as the king's grandson. Who is it? Sargon the First. Okay? A couple thousand years before there's a biblical tradition, we have the first Babylonian Empire, and we know this from a cuneiform, a stone, where Sargon I's victory story is told, and this is his birth story. So did it happen twice? Or was it that in culling our own stories, did we take the great legends that even predate us and put them into a document? So what we have is what we'll call Torah, the tangible, is a redacted compilation of those stories, those conversations, the ethos that should help us build a community that makes sense. And that's why Torah doesn't have a problem being inconsistent. 4 different creation stories in the first 6 chapters. In one place, you have Aaron and Aaron's offspring being the high priests forever and ever and ever exclusively, and in another place you have the entire tribe of Levi being the priests forever and ever and ever exclusively. And we don't worry about the inconsistencies because it wasn't intended to be consistent. It was intended to provoke the conversation. And a guy named Rashi, 1,000 years ago, one of the great scholars, said that there are times the Torah screams, Darsheni, debate me. We read some horrendous stuff. And if we're biblical literalists, then that empowers us to do horrendous things. And yet the tradition is supposed to move us to see these things, these texts. They're supposed to shock our conscience, and we're supposed to then debate the text and create the conversation so that we would never do those things. And this isn't liberal Judaism, this is Rashi, 1,000 years ago. So when we talk about how we see the wisdom of Torah and who it tells us to take care of and how we're supposed to engage, it really is a universal document, limited only when we choose in conversation to limit its impact. When I was in Lexington, I participated with a group of friends, clergy, in a weekly study when we studied the Christian Common Lectionary every week, which is based on 2 Old Testament readings and then 2 from the New Testament. And I was amazed to see how the texts that we call our Jewish texts are used in the New Testament context. And by the way, the New Testament authors are mostly all Jewish. So if you read the New Testament through a Jewish lens, it's a very Jewish book. It doesn't have the same import if you read it from a different perspective. But these teachings then become universal in building community and how we're supposed to take care of what's going on for everybody. So we get to the first couple. We get to Adam and Eve, and their experience in Eden is pretty bland. There's ignorance. They know nothing. They get up, they eat, they sleep, they get up, they eat, they sleep, and that's their existence. Until Eve says, there's got to be more to life than this. And so there's 2 major trees in the Garden of Eden. One is the tree of life, and one is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And most mistakenly, God never says, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. God says, if you eat from the tree of knowledge, then you will die, which means you're no longer allowed to eat from the tree of life. So take your choice. You can eat from one or the other. And a hint as to why, by the way, comes somewhere around the end of the Garden of Eden story, and somewhere in chapter 3, where God says, because if you were allowed to do both, you'd be like me, God. God doesn't want competition. And understand, I guess I should have said this at the beginning, God, the biblical God, is not God. The biblical God is the God of our ability to concretize a character in the story that controls, prompts conversation, loves, hates. God is anthropomorphized in the Bible. God has human instincts and human failings, and God throws temper tantrums like 2-year-olds in the Torah. And I refuse to believe that that's God, whatever it is. And Maimonides, as I said earlier, said that to try to say what God is pure blasphemy. So the moment we try to say God is this, or God says this, or God wants this, we're really outside of the tradition that says God is truly the ineffable, the unknowable. And if you study mysticism, God is Ein Sof, which is there's no definition that can put God in any type of box. So the biblical God says, I don't want competition, but so Eve will take from this fruit, and immediately her eyes are opened, and she shares it with her husband. And what is Adam's response? Especially when God says, did you eat of the fruit? And Adam, in true male form, if I may, look, she made me eat it. I didn't want that wisdom stuff, but she made me eat it. And St. Augustine decided that that is the role of woman as temptress. The problem with temptation is you have to have knowledge that there's something good before you can be tempted. And so we're talking about something innate in women that may not be innate in men. How do we know that we play that out in our tradition? What is the traditional age for bat mitzvah? 12. What is the traditional age for bar mitzvah? Why? Because that's the way it's supposed to be. The women in the Torah have the traits of greater sense of wisdom and understanding, and that's where we begin our story. So when Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden with this understanding that there are blessings and curses in life, you get to know the blessing of love, and yes, you get to know the challenge of pain. Neither existed before that. But how many of us would want to go back to a time where there was no love? I don't know anybody. Every funeral I perform, I start with, how many of us would not want to be here today if it meant not knowing the person that we're here to honor? And I've never had a hand go up, because we love people and we know that our time here is finite. And so we want to make sure that we get everything we can and share with each other along that life's path. What our prayer is in that moment is, one, a prayer of thanksgiving that we had the time that we had and the experiences that we could share, and two, somewhat innately, that we hope that when our time to come happens, that there'll be people there who are thankful that we were part of their lives as well. It's very organic. So we're all in this together, and knowledge is organic, and it's something that is supposed to happen. And at no point in this time when we talk about knowledge and even Torah are we talking about Jews. We're talking about creation of life. And then we get to the story of the Tower of Babel. And here I'll confess I have a somewhat radical understanding of it, which I don't think is that radical because it's what it says, but the people want to get to know God more intimately. And so they build a ziggurat, a tower that's higher than anything else, so they can get into the heavens so that they can reach God. And they do. And God's response is to take down the tower and send these people to every corner of the earth, speaking all different languages. Now, tradition will say that we were punished for arrogance. I read that as, how cool is it that knowledge of God is now spoken in every language of the world in every corner of the earth? And so the opportunity to read this text and say, this is the beginning of a sense of universal faith where we all matter, where everybody's relationship in whatever language it is, all stems from that same place, that desire, that human desire to have an intimate relationship with God, however we see that. So we fast forward a few billion years. I know that was quick, just follow along. And we get to Sinai, and we get to the what we call now the holiday of Shavuot, where Moses receives the Ten Commandments at Sinai. And there's an interesting, if I may, statement of universality that we read and tied to this. We don't read it, though, until we get to Deuteronomy. And we read it on Yom Kippur. It's from the Parshat Nitzavim, the end of, actually, Deuteronomy. And it says that, first of all, the covenant is not so far in the heavens that someone has to bring it to you. And it's not so far across the water that someone has to bring it to you. that each of us intimately holds that covenant right here in our hearts and in our hands and our being, which means that we're all going to internalize it individually, uniquely to ourselves. And then it says, and I make this covenant with everybody who's here today. It singles out the men, the women, the children, the water drawers, everybody. And everybody who's not here this day. So who is the covenant made with? With everybody. Individually, each of us. Those that pre-existed, because Torah pre-exists, but also those who have come long after. And when we take that covenant and we've decided that it only applies to me or to you or to this group who see that the world through the very same lens, we at that point have breached the covenant. And that's part of the ethos behind the classic Jewish joke we've shared several times today. If you have 5 Jews, you've got all these different opinions. But that's the way it's supposed to be. But it's not just within the Jewish world. One of the first scholar residencies I did after I was ordained was in Florence, South Carolina, at a Baptist church in Effingham, a really small town next to a really small town. And first of all, I think I shared this with Michael earlier, people came late. And afterwards, the pastor said, now you can't leave until you've eaten, because that's what we do. And I said, where do you think you got it? Jewish Standard Time, and it's all. The center word in all of Torah, anybody? Beton. What does beton mean? Stomach. And I look it up. The entire Torah revolves around the stomach. How Jewish is that? So, but in the meantime, as I'm teaching and we're going through this, I'm getting questions about these very same things. We think of Christianity as being from a fundamentalist base, but there's a breadth of difference in how people understand Christianity and the relationship with the Old Testament and even the role of Christ. And so when we talk about how we don't agree, I think that's universal in all faiths in all the world. And yet we all show up in a relevant place, and we're all seeking the engagement with community. And we can walk out even not agreeing, but feeling blessed to have been with each other and made whole because of that engagement. So how does it play out in the real world? I referenced the Talmud earlier, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These words and these words are both the words of the living God. 1,500 years ago, it was good enough for the Amorim, it's good for me, which means that we don't not only don't we have to agree, we don't have to speak the same language. We don't have to speak the same theologies, but all of it is God. And that allows us to understand that never mind the Western traditions, but all of the world's religious traditions. And by the way, I don't believe there's such a thing as polytheism. I think that polytheism is a word that we apply to traditions that we don't understand. Okay, how many gods are there according to the Jewish tradition? 1. Shema Yisrael Adonai Echad, right? So why are there 72 names for God in Exodus? And then there's El Shaddai, El Elyon, Hamakom, Hamakor, all these different names for God, and yet we're going to say they're one God. But we call on each of those different aspects of the one God based on what we need in prayer or in that moment. And the same thing in Christianity, where it's a Trinity, which, by the way, was created by a Jew, a guy named Philo, and misread by Paul as it applies to Christianity. But that's for another seminar and another time. But the concept of Trinity, it's not 3 different gods. It's God, creator, God incarnate, as God would come to earth, and then the Logos, which is the connection of God, making sure that God connects both ethereally and physically. And Mount Olympus is God. The different aspects of God in the Greek tradition are Hera and Zeus and all of that, but the Godhead is Mount Olympus. And so if we look at the tradition as it's practiced in respective parts of the world, we all believe in one God, just very differently. And I think that's a piece that if we really could wrap our heads around it, would bridge so many of the gaps that separate us from each other. And so our tradition, specifically as Jews, going back to Torah, is to say that you don't have to see the world through my lens, you don't have to see God through my lens, but I can't save this world without accepting who you are and how you see the world and how you see God and dignifying it whether I get it or I don't get it, as opposed to rejecting people with whom we don't agree or who don't agree with us. And so you get that. Then you get Dina de Malchuta Dina. If we weren't sure of how we were to play out our role in the real world, we're taught in Talmud that we have to be good citizens. The law of the land I live in is the law I live by. So Rav Soloveitchik, one of the great halachists of the early 19th century, was confronted by a yeshiva that was struggling financially. And so they wanted his blessing to not pay taxes. This is in Europe. They weren't tax exempt as we are in the United States, okay? And so they were going to save the money by not paying taxes so they could pay the stipends to the rabbinical students. And he turned them into the government because they were tax evaders. So, we can't favor our own in this. We have to make sure that if we live in a community, we have to live by their rules. And that's why, by the way, that we do things very differently in Southern California Jewishly than they do in Boston, different than South Carolina. Never mind the Ashkenazic, Sephardic, Moroccan, and Yemenite different traditions. And it's all Jewish. So up until about 15 years ago, was rice kosher for Passover? In the Sephardic tradition, it absolutely was. In the Ashkenazic tradition, it was not. Because in the Ashkenazic tradition, if it's potentially leavened, it's forbidden. In the Sephardic world is, if it's leavened, it's forbidden. I'm blessed that the rabbinate got together, and with the exception of the farther ends of the Orthodox world, that we've all agreed that kitniot are fine, rice and beans are fine for Passover so long as they're not already fermented. So you go to, if you're Ashkenazic and you go to a Sephardic home, you don't have to worry about what they're serving you. And by the way, to the extent that it was ever kosher, Taco Bell is kosher for everybody now. Corn tortillas, you can still do Taco Bell during Passover, okay? Like I said, to the extent that it met kashrut, okay? When I was first year in rabbinical school and we were in Jerusalem, there was the attempt to create the American hamburger stand. And there was a place called McDavid's. It really wasn't very good. But then in Tel Aviv, they opened the first Wendy's. Kosher. So I had my now late wife and our two very young children, and we rented a car. We drove to Tel Aviv so that we could get Wendy's. And we didn't even think that the Frosties were non-dairy ice cream. And it was like frozen Cremora. It was just so disappointing. But in any event, as I expressed earlier, sometimes I wonder, and I apologize, but it is. So, but the real world also means that kashrut. So we're not allowed to eat the hind quarter of an animal, right? Why? According to the Torah, because Jacob's hip is wrenched in the middle of the wrestling match. And you got to love the language of Torah where it says, and that's why to this day we don't eat the thigh meat, which means obviously it's not a eyewitness account. And then the rabbis will extrapolate from that further that the richest blood source exchange is in the hind quarter. And since you're not allowed to eat the blood with the meat, so you don't eat the hind quarter because it's too hard to kosher. What do you do with it? You're not allowed to benefit from it, so you can't sell it. Okay? You can't waste the animal, so you can't throw it away. So built into the system is the acknowledgement that we live near people in a wider community that live by different rules than we live, and that we have a relationship with them such that we can give them that hind quarter, and they're not suspicious of it being tainted, etc., and no request for remuneration, that's what neighbors do. They respect, and we respect. And yet there's this great divergence of practice, and everybody is okay. Everybody wins. And so Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, said that the world is really kind of like a puzzle. And our destiny, our piece of this puzzle is unique, and it's only ours. And yet, the world can't ever be whole without our piece, and we can never stand alone because then we're devoid of the rest of the puzzle. So we're a piece of a unique piece of civilization. And that's how we see our role, to make sure that we continue to teach who we are and why we are and how it evolves, and at the same time, never in a vacuum how we work with the rest of the world. So we have an obligation to do all this, because if we're going to restore that vessel, we have to be so intimately involved in the world around us that nobody is suspicious, that we take care of each other, that we remember that if there's a hole under your side of the rowboat, I'm going down too, so I have to be as vigilant for the safety of your side of the boat as my own, knowing that because of the relationship, you're watching my side of the boat too. We have to remember that our liturgy speaks to this. Every morning in the morning liturgy, we're told that we have to, as the Reformed Prayer Book translates it, make peace where there's strife. But the text actually says, turn our enemy into our friend. It doesn't mean not hate the enemy. It doesn't mean stop saying bad things about the enemy. It says we have to turn our enemy into our friend, which means we have to intimately get to know the people around us and understand why they tick, and why they tick differently than we do, remembering that perspective is everything. So George Washington is a hero here, but not in Great Britain. Right? And that's something we don't think about when we think about differing perspectives. So at a Passover Seder, originally, in the Torah, you're not allowed to have a non-member of the community at your Seder table. And I say community because the Ger Toshav, the stranger who was with you, was part of the community. Doesn't have to be a member of the tribe, but the stranger who lives with you is there. But the strangers are not supposed to be at your Seder table, because you ate the Paschal lamb that was sacrificed at the altar, and that was for the community. Well, the temple's destroyed, and hundreds of years later, Maimonides is looking at that and says, well, we're not allowed to eat lamb at all at Passover Seder, because we're not allowed to eat lamb if it wasn't sacrificed at the temple. And so if you go to the 4 questions that you read at Seder, it used to say on this night, on all of the nights you can eat any other kosher meat. It doesn't say kosher, but meat. But on this night you eat lamb. But then that no longer applied by Maimonides' time, and so he changed the 4th question. What is the 4th question today? I can sit or recline, but tonight as a free person, I recline. He created that because the question as it existed no longer was relevant. So our tradition evolves. So now we not only have changed some of that, but we've also changed how we do things. Now it's a mitzvah to invite strangers to our Seder table. And unfortunately, so many of us treat that as an opportunity to show them what Jews do, when the reality is it's supposed to be a conversation about freedom and how do we learn from each other. You're not allowed to end the Seder traditionally until all questions have been answered, which include ours of our neighbors. But we don't usually get to that because it's our event. So with this in mind, and with the understanding that we have this sacred obligation to look past ourselves and sometimes way out of our own comfort zones, if we're going to do the work of healing the world, what does it say about the future of relevant Judaism? How do we play that message out in a world where we no longer have Jewish communities? We don't have people who go to the neighborhood shul. We don't have the shtetl where you never would look outside for a potential mate or spouse. And as I said earlier, you send your children out to engage the world, and they come home engaged to someone in the world. And what does that mean for Jewish continuity? Which means we have to be asking some very different questions than we've been asking for what's relevant and what needs to be important as we move forward. And so this is really where I want to throw it to you. what do we do to make sure that this congregation, but more, Torah, is here 20 years from now, knowing how radically the world is changing? And the beginning of the responses, I hope, has to begin with, we know that from the before Torah existed, before creation existed, we were commanded to build a world entire, not just a Jewish-dominated world. So how do we do that and maintain, love, and grow our Jewish tradition? So this is where I need some thoughts and some input if you have, and please. Yeah. We need to find a way to include more people in our tent. Carrie Olitsky, Rabbi Olitsky, a friend of mine, ran for a while an organization called Big Tent Judaism. And the Reform movement stole Big Tent for how it sees its evolution Jewishly. But the whole idea was, how do we engage the world in new ways? So you're right, Michael, that we have to make sure that our boundaries are not seen as boundaries, but as guidelines for engagement. And I think that's not a semantic argument. Okay? Kevin says you have to adapt to the times, but now, what does that mean in terms of maintaining the sacredness of who we are, at the same time responding to what's out there? The response was it has to evolve, maybe not to what it was thousands of years ago or to expectations, but what it needs to be. And then the added comment was, as I commented earlier, that the bylaws are 12 years old and need to be looked at as well. Okay. I just want to make sure they get the full commentary, okay? Yes. And I agree with all of that, and it's part of our tradition. When we talk about Shabbat activity, and we're not allowed to light a fire, according to the strictest of halakha. So what does that mean? How does that play out in 2022? No fires on Shabbat. The first exception, well, if you light it before Shabbat, and have you ever had cholent? Some of it is really good. Some of it, yeah. Mitch? You let it keep burning. Can you drive a car on Shabbat? If you turn the ignition before Shabbat and you left it running and you don't hit the accelerator, I'm serious, okay? Then it's already running and you haven't created new energy and a new energy exchange. Then you can hit the brake, you can stop it, you can put your foot off the brake and it can go again. Okay, the question is, can you turn it off? And probably not until the Shabbat's over. And then there's this lovely thing called the Shabbat Goy. Okay, what's the role of the Shabbos Goy?
To turn on the engine.
To turn on the engine, to do all that stuff on Shabbat. Now, if we go back to Exodus, it says for Shabbat, Exodus 20, your family, your animals, the servants, the people who work for you, nobody can do work on Shabbat. Now, I want to know how you figure out Shabbat Goy when it says nobody, including those who serve you. That's why I'm a Reformed Jew, okay? So that's another exception, how we get around it. Early trips to Jerusalem, to Israel, you knew that if you were going to have a dinner or a lunch or a breakfast in a hotel, it was going to be a cold meal. Why? Because you can't turn the ovens on. Several years ago, I was there, and I could order a hot meal. And I asked how that happened, and they said it's computer generated. The computer turns it on and turns it off. So we've always tried to create the ways of living and enjoying and celebrating life, even while spiritually remembering the roots from where we come. An eruv, you're not allowed to carry things on Shabbat outside your home. So you put a wire around the telephone poles, around the community, and that's your home now. So you can now still be social with your neighbors and carry that casserole as if you're going from one room to another room. All right? And we can call it a legal fiction, and we can say, oh, you're making it up as you go along. Or we can say, these are ways that you can live in modernity and adapt to what's necessary and not give up remembering the sacredness of that day and its command to do things differently.
But does that not still beg the question about how do we grow community? Because I could see it constituting in two ways. One, how do we grow the Jewish community, the Jewish identified, not spiritually community, but the Jewish identified community to want to come into, quote, our physical community? Do we expand outside of our physical community? Or do we take the much more expansive way and say we can identify Jewish, we can bring in all of the community, Jewish and non-Jewish, so that we're doing some kind of community even outside of the, quote, traditional Jewish community? Your question sort of led me to think, do we invite everyone in Fullerton, Jewish and non-Jewish, because it's all community, so that we have a sense of community? Or how do we find the uninvolved Jews, the totally uninvolved Jews that we know exist out here, to want to open themselves to come to this community? Let's see about the issue of pocketbooks, just coming to the community to want to be a part of it. That's the question I think that you're posing to me.
And I think it's probably the most relevant bare bones of the conversations. It's the tachlis from which everything grows, and Jewish communities have answered it in different ways. Some will argue that you welcome everybody, and that will bring more people who are Jewishly unaffiliated, but may help them affiliate. It will bring some converts. It'll also bring people who will support the community even from the outside. And we're already doing a little bit of that in most of our communities when you have interreligious marriages. You're bringing someone who's not Jewish and asking that person to support the community. So there's already an element of that in what most liberal synagogues are doing today. The other answer to that is, and I think it's a more closely drawn answer, is the more we're visible out there, the more people that don't know we're here, Jews, the more that Jews are concerned with what it means to be a member because of the myths that are out there, too religious, too expensive, too this, too that, too demanding. We get rid of some of those myths, and people can see it's a community for engagement. So the 40-plus families that have joined Monmouth Reformed Temple during COVID, not one of them came because they were in the sanctuary, because we couldn't use the sanctuary during COVID. But it became clear that we were still growing food in our garden for the food pantries. And people will become more and more aware of hunger, and they said, oh, if you're doing that for the world, that's the place I'd want to be part of. And so people were affiliating with the synagogue to be involved in some of that work because we were out in the public doing it. So the idea of, on either of those spectrums, is to take the synagogue outside of the walls of the synagogue for the work that we do. And from my perspective, I teach that and believe wholeheartedly, you don't get volunteer hours for putting your children to bed. You don't get volunteer hours for taking out the trash or for mowing your own lawn. And that's because you're doing it for your family. Well, this is your family. That's how we're supposed to see ourselves. This is our religious, our spiritual family. And so we don't ask people to volunteer here. We ask people to love us and this place enough that they want to give some piece of who they are, whatever that niche is, some more, some less, some time, some dollars, some whatever, but commit some piece of them to our family. And then the volunteer work we do is what we as a community do out there. And that's, again, not just a semantic argument, because it changes the whole conversation about relationships. Who are we with each other? And then our community is doing stuff out there. Otherwise, volunteering here, volunteering out there, we're volunteer. Those are volunteer hours. And how many of us have inordinate numbers of volunteer hours to give. And, if I volunteer here, it means cutting the lawn of the synagogue. If I volunteer out there, I'm feeding people. The priority would be the feeding the people. But if this is where you see your sacred family commitment, then you say, oh, I've got to mow the lawn, and then I got to go out and feed the people. And that's a change in ethos of how we see community. And it is infectious. And so you could read it as we're going to water everything down and just welcome everybody here so we can feed the budget. But that's not what it does if we do it with the intentionality of Torah is valuable and it's the basis of who we are. And when people come in here, they find a meaningful engagement with a tradition that is thousands of years old that understands the need to evolve, adapt to where we need to be to continue to be relevant in the real world. Somebody else. Or Mitch, you can go again. I'm not limiting you.
Social media. My grandkids want to do everything on their iPhones, iPads, and sit in their room. How do I get them to engage in their community when I can't get them out of the room to leave their mechanical machine? And what is the role of social media and such fancy words as TikTok and Facebook that I don't know anything about?
The best answer I have found in practice is to create Jewish, meaningfully Jewish, fun Jewish, etc. ways that they can still use their same social media. The bigger picture is for us to adapt how we are. How many emails do you get a day? And then the synagogue sends out another email. And then you wonder, well, I didn't see that event happen. Well, it was one of 600 emails you got yesterday, and, even the bulletin. You get the bulletin by email, and you say, okay, I'm going to open it, and I'll save it and read it. And then you get 500 emails afterwards, and you forgot that it was open, as opposed to the printed bulletin, which stays on the coffee table, which is a more likely chance of being read than another email. But through TikTok, through Instagram, through all of those services, we reach people in a place where they are looking. Our young families are using text messages, they're using Instagram, they're using TikTok, and the litany of those services go on. And so if we want to let people know what we're doing, then we ought to have the Instagram of the day, of the mission of this congregation. They may see most of them, and you're lucky because you don't inundate people, because Instagram can't be very long. Snapchat, Instagram, these things don't last very long. And so it's a quick hit, and it's with appropriate marketing, it sparks an interest such that, oh, maybe I should call on that. And so that's social media in general, but, and as I think I explained earlier in our Hebrew curriculum, asking our youth who are studying the prayer Barhut to learn to read it, to learn to understand praise, and then to create an Instagram page for that prayer. All of a sudden, their skills, their social media skills, are used in Jewish education. And there's some great programs out there to teach Torah, to teach Talmud, to teach Hebrew for kids using the media that are available. And they're wonderful tools. And it helps kids see that it's not wasted time, it's productive time. There's a young lady who I guess is on the cover of Hadassah magazine this month, who teaches Talmud through TikTok. And I've watched a couple of the episodes, and again, they're very short, and they're very entertaining, and wow. In just a minute, I have learned something new from my ancient tradition in a way that is internal. I can make internal, whatever the word would be. Thank you. Yeah, internalize. I'm good at making up words at times. So that's the best answer I can give you. If we create relevant things, they're going to be in front of this. But when we can give them things that are enticing and intriguing, first step is that time is no longer wasted time, it's educational time. And then we can present opportunities for them to use that in other settings, which includes, I learned this one now, this is beyond me, my daughter, or Lori's my daughter, would be in a room with her friends, all staring at their phones and texting. And I said, you're in a room, why don't you talk to each other? Well, we are. Well, with your voices. Well, but there's two girls who aren't here, and if we're talking to each other, they miss out on the conversation, and so we're texting so everybody can stay involved. That's not our sentimentality. We want to see each other's face, but think about the desire to not exclude a friend from a conversation because of using social media, which is also a blessing if we can see it in that light. Okay, so you've been muted. No.
Now I have a question. Did I understand you to say earlier that the concept is that God did not give Torah to the Jews, that God gave Torah to all mankind?
That's what our tradition teaches.
See, maybe I skipped that day in religious school, but that's not the way I learned it. And when we have when we read the Haggadah at Seder, and we say Dayenu, we talk about God giving us the Torah, not humankind, not mankind. God gave it to us. Do I have it wrong?
No, but there's two definitions to the us. Okay, the us is the people around that table, and by extension, Jews at Seder. But us doesn't mean exclusive of other people as well. So we have to remember that there are no Jews in the Torah. There's Israel. Judah is 1/12 of the tribes. And what happens to the tribes in the north? They take this tradition and spread it all over the world, very similar to which is where I took my lead on the Tower of Babel story. And so the us doesn't exclude other us's. So God gave me the Torah. My parents gave me a college education. They also gave my siblings a college education. So the fact that I've internalized it to me doesn't mean I'm the only one that got that from them. So Moses is a Levite, and they're one of the tribes that don't have an inheritance at all. Even though Jeremiah is a Levite and redeems family property, but again, that's in last week's Haftarah, and that's a whole other conversation. But so when we talk about reception of Torah, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time that we get Torah, doesn't mean that it was walled, and that's why the Mechilta 2,000 years ago, and that's why the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the late Rebbe, and many voices in between remind us that it's ours, but not exclusively ours. It's the ours in a big way, and so we will have a unique take on it, but Christianity's created a unique take on it, and if you see how it applies in other traditions, they've got unique takes on it. And I personally have no problem with a church doing a Passover Seder so long as it's not a supersessionist Seder. And that the difference is to say, it's one thing to say they see that the Passover leads to the sacrifice and redemption of Christ. It's another thing to say, and the Jews got it wrong all this time, and so we're the right way, and that's the antiquated way. It's because the Old Testament is part of the Christian Bible, intimately, and it's part of the Quran. In fact, if you read the story of Musa going to Pharaoh, it's to let my people go, and Musa performs the miracles of the snake turning the staff and the snake, and Pharaoh leads the people out of bondage. That was enough for Pharaoh to change Pharaoh's mind. So there's a different take on that story as well, and yet it's the same redemptive holiday. And so I like to ask, when I do Seders in different communities, what would it look like if all of the Jews were to celebrate Passover with the understanding that redemption is the goal, that Bashana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, doesn't mean we're in the city 8,000, or now from here, I guess it's 12,000 miles away. But Jerusalem is right here, Yerushalayim, my vision of wholeness and peace. And so the tradition says that Jerusalem is your table. May the peace that we experience at this table be more whole next year. So if we did that, and the Christian world would understand as redemption of all who are oppressed in the world, and if the Muslim world were to understand that day as redemption for all, how would the world conversation be different? And because our scriptures, our sacred scriptures, all own that story. And that's why, well, of course, the Mechilta is long before there's other religions, but that's why so many voices, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe, reminded us that it's not our story only. And I think that's sacred space there. So it is ours, but not just.
Rabbi, we're coming to the end of our hour, so if you want to say a few words to wrap it up.
First of all, I thank everyone for being here, for putting up with me, and for engaging. And I understand that some of the things I've said have stretched some boundaries, but that's education. And I have learned from my teachers, some of whom are much older and some of whom are much younger, some of whom are from outside the tradition, that this world can't be whole in any moment where we're talking about an us versus them. And we never have to compromise who we are. If we're safe and we're secure in our faith, if I'm truly a faithful Jew, then I'm not compromised when I walk into a Baptist church and help ordain a black Baptist minister as I did last Sunday. Or when I'm speaking at an iftar during Ramadan in a mosque. I can be who I am as rabbi and as a Jew, and my faith demands me to help other people be able to be faithful in their traditions as well. And in those conversations is where we grow the relationships that help see us through all sorts of things. And to that end, I guess the last piece of that, when I was in Florence, South Carolina, a pastor wrote an op-ed one day in the newspaper that said Hitler did God's work. And of course, immediately there's the knee-jerk, horrific. I understand he meant that in the same sense that God kills God's only son in a Christian tradition, so for redemption of the world needed redeemed. God killed the chosen, God's chosen, no different than Jesus is chosen, for the redemption of the world. Now, that is a horrific statement given history, and I know that the pastor intended it without trying to be anti-Semitic, without even thinking about the anti-Semitism, however it played out. Well, that day happened to be the day that I have lunch with several of my ministerial friends. I got to lunch, and they each handed me their response to that pastor that had already been sent to the newspapers, and the rabbi did not have to respond to that. My response could be to call the pastor and say, "This is what I think, am I right?" And yes, he was very embarrassed that he hadn't understood it in a different context. But the fact that it didn't put the rabbi against Christianity in the public was huge. And that happens because of the dignity with forming of these relationships, understanding from the very beginning it's about all of us. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. We'll end our Zoom at that.
Thank you, everybody watching.